Welcome to another edition of Life, Love, and Philosophy. This is the sixth in a series of programs I'm doing on morality and what famous thinkers in philosophy, psychology, literature, and religion have said about it. I've been addressing the question, what should be our guide in determining what is moral and what is immoral? In previous programs, I discussed in some detail the possibility of using one's conscience or a holy book as one's guide. I tried to show that while both may be useful, neither one is a perfect guide. It has not been unusual over the centuries that people using their conscience or a holy book as a guide to morality have done great evil in this world. In my last program, I zeroed in on the possibility of using one's reason, one's intellect, as a guide to morality. There have been philosophers over the centuries called rationalists who believed that reason will provide the best guidance in determining what is moral. I pointed out, however, that just as problems arise in using one's conscience or a holy book as a guide, so too there are problems in using reason as a guide. For example, people may reason about a particular moral issue and come to opposite conclusions. Some obvious examples: abortion, capital punishment, the legalization of prostitution, state lotteries, premarital sex. Nietzsche, the very famous German philosopher, pointed out this problem in using reason. He claimed it's impossible to reason without our feelings affecting our reason. Indeed, Nietzsche, who himself was a philosopher, criticized his fellow philosophers who claimed that they had reached their philosophical conclusions solely on the basis of reason. Nietzsche said, not so, that philosophers, like other people, when reasoning, often rely on a hunch, an assumption, a kind of inspiration. Indeed, Nietzsche claimed that philosophers really had based their conclusions on desires of the heart, that it was desires of the heart, essentially, that led them to their philosophical conclusions. Professor Huston Smith, very famous professor of comparative religion in the United States. Indeed, Huston Smith is the most famous of contemporary professors of comparative religion in the United States. Professor Smith was raised in China. His parents were American missionaries who lived in China, and Smith learned to speak Chinese. And he said that on this issue of feelings affecting our reasoning, the Chinese language provides some illumination. He says that the Chinese language at least implies that it may be impossible to separate feelings from reason. And he explains, he says this, that in the Chinese language, the character that designates mind, again the written character, that designates mind also designates heart, which shows that the Chinese took it for granted that reason functions in a context of attitudes and emotions. Professor Smith goes on to say this: unless our hearts prompt us to cooperate, reason will devise clever strategies to further self-interest. In other words, the idea is we often find reasons to validate our feelings. Well, what can we do to reason more effectively? Well, some argue that it can be good to use reason in conjunction with feelings, that the decisive factor is which feelings we are using in conjunction with reason. For example, are we using empathy, compassion, or love when we reason? Or is our reasoning accompanied by feelings of anger and hatred? The idea is that empathy and compassion and love can help us to reason more effectively, that they contribute to clear thinking, whereas anger and hatred interfere with clear thinking. So the bottom line is this: some philosophers and men and women of letters have argued that if we use reason along with love, that the result of that kind of reasoning is likely to be productive reasoning. And they would refer, I think, to such reasoning as good reasoning. Whereas, if one is trying to reason to come to some conclusion as to whether something is moral or immoral, and one is reasoning while angry or hateful, that combination is likely to be productive of bad reasoning and poor conclusions concerning what is moral and what is immoral. Some of the great philosophers concede that reason is an imperfect guide to what is moral or immoral, but that nevertheless it's the best thing we have, that reason is the best thing we have. Karl Popper and Richard Rorty were very famous 20th century philosophers. They both believed that democracy was the best form of government, and the reason democracy is the best form of government is that democracy, more than any other form of government, relies on reason to come to conclusions. For example, in democratic countries, when the legislature is arguing about whether something should be a law or not, generally speaking, in democracies there are debates, not only debates in the legislature, but debates in the media, the press, television, radio. And Professors Popper and Rorty thought that was very good, that it's through debates, it's through looking at an issue from different perspectives, looking at the advantages, the disadvantages of possible legislation, that we can do good reasoning. And that also, in a democracy, when people are on trial for a particular crime, that we have an adversarial procedure whereby the prosecutor has his say, but then the defendant's lawyer also has his say. So the jury gets to listen to two perspectives on what may or may not have happened. And again, Professors Popper and Rorty would say this involves people reasoning to come to conclusions, and that's good. What might be another possible guide to determining what is moral or immoral? Again, so far, I've talked about the possibility of using one's conscience, a holy book, and reason. Well, some famous thinkers have argued that perhaps the best guide to morality is the law of the land. However, if one decides that that will be one's guide, that also has some problems. And I think Montaigne, the very famous 16th century French intellectual, provides some illumination here, because he provides some, I think, valid criticisms of the law. And before I give you Montaigne's perspective on this, let me point out that Montaigne, besides being considered to have been a famous writer, even philosopher, was originally a lawyer. That was his initial career, and he spent many years working as a lawyer. Well, Montaigne says this about the law. The laws maintain their credit, not because they are just, but because they are laws. He goes on to say that laws are often made by fools, and more often laws are made by men who have no interest in equality, no interest in justice. He then goes on to say that all laws are made by men. Remember now, he's writing in the 16th century. All laws are made by men, and men are vain and unstable creatures. He then says this: there is nothing so ordinarily faulty as the laws. Whoever obeys them because they are just is not, as he should be, obeying them for a just reason. Pretty powerful words from this famous French intellectual. Again, he says laws are made by men, and men by nature are vain and unstable creatures. And then he goes on to at least imply that lawmakers often have selfish reasons in making the laws they make. Perhaps they make the laws they make to protect themselves and their selfish interests, and the selfish interests of their families, and the selfish interests of their supporters. Hence, according to Montaigne, some laws will inevitably be unfair, unjust, and immoral. And what might be some historical examples of immoral laws? Well, the most obvious illustration is slavery. For many centuries, slavery was legal in most areas of the world. Indeed, the original U.S. Constitution made slavery legal. The U.S. Constitution, of course, is the law of the land. It's our basic law. It's the rule book, so to speak, for the United States. And it wasn't until after the Civil War, approximately 80 years after the Constitution was written, that we amended it. We changed it to make slavery illegal. Indeed, perhaps the most famous case ever decided by the Supreme Court before the Civil War, again when slavery was legal, was the Dred Scott case. Perhaps you remember it from your school days. Dred Scott was a slave who was brought from the southern area of the United States to a northern state that did not have slavery. And Dred Scott sued in court for his freedom. His claim was that since he was now living in a free state of the United States, he was entitled to his freedom. Well, the case eventually went to the Supreme Court. And how did the Supreme Court, the highest court in our country, decide this case, this issue? Well, the Supreme Court said, first of all, that Dred Scott had no right even to sue in court because he was not a citizen. The court then went on to say that the fact that Dred Scott was now living in a free area of the United States was irrelevant. Why irrelevant? Because the Supreme Court said that according to the U.S. Constitution, Dred Scott, this black slave, was property. And if a person, for example, brought a chair from a slave state to a free state, well, that person still owned that chair. Well, by the same token, if a slave owner brought a slave from a slave state into a free state, since the slave, according to the rule book, according to the Constitution, was property, that Scott was not entitled to his freedom. So this was a great defeat for those who believed that simply transporting a slave from a slave area to a free area would automatically ensure his freedom. We know that there were other immoral laws concerning slavery. In previous programs, I pointed out that most, if not all, the southern states in the United States, when slavery existed, had laws prohibiting the education of black children, black slave children. Why so? Why prohibit the education of black slave children? Well, again, as I pointed out before, the idea was that if one educated slaves, they would be less docile, more difficult to control. So the idea was they should not be educated. Can you imagine? Can you imagine the fact that certain southern states in our history forbade the education of certain children? Also, the laws of the United States generally provided no legal protection to slaves. I wrote the thesis for my master's degree on slavery. I spent about a year, probably more, doing extensive research on slavery. And I found no historical example of a slaveholder being arrested for physically abusing, even mutilating, even raping a slave. The idea was in the South, you could physically abuse a slave. You could cut a slave's finger off. You could brand him on the face with a hot iron. You could rape a slave and get away with it. There were laws prohibiting intercourse, sexual intercourse between blacks and whites, or whites and blacks, I should say, meaning even between white slave owners and black slaves. But there was virtually no way to enforce that law. So a white slave owner knew if he raped his slave, even though that was technically illegal, there was virtually no way he would be ever prosecuted. One of the reasons being that a slave could not testify in court. A slave could not testify in court against anyone. Also, we know that after the Civil War, once slavery was abolished by a constitutional amendment, it did not by any means end discrimination towards black people. For the next 100 years after the Civil War, for the next 100 years after the Civil War, until the 1960s, black people in the South suffered terrible discrimination. What southern states did to take revenge on black people for the fact they had lost the Civil War was to impose a system of racial segregation on black people, a system of racial segregation imposed by law. It was a cradle to the grave system of segregation. What do I mean by that? Well, blacks and whites were separated by law in hospitals, schools. Blacks went to one set of public schools, whites to another. Restaurants. Blacks went to one set of luncheonettes and restaurants, whites to another. Theaters. Black people usually have to sit in the back. Beaches, parks, buses, trains. We know, generally speaking, blacks have to sit in the back of the bus or in certain train cars. Even cemeteries. White cemeteries, black cemeteries. By the way, what was the purpose of these laws? Well, so many historians tell us the purpose of these laws was to keep black people in their place. The idea was that, yes, the North had freed blacks as a result of the Civil War, but that nevertheless white Southerners, at least the bigots among them, did not want black people to feel they were the equals of white people. By the way, no other group in American history suffered legal separation, other than, I should say, the Chinese and the Japanese during World War II in the internment camps. But even the Chinese and other Asians never suffered from the pervasiveness of the exclusion that was imposed on black people. Even churches were segregated. Indeed, the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. pointed out that 11 a.m. on Sunday mornings was the most segregated hour in America. Blacks going to one set of churches and whites going to another set of churches, especially in the South. Also, it wasn't just laws forcing black people to be separate from white people that imposed a kind of inferiority on black people. Southern states also passed laws designed to prevent black people from voting. I will say that again. Southern states passed laws specifically designed to prevent black people from voting. It was not until the 1960s, 1965 to be specific, that the U.S. Congress passed a law abolishing all these state efforts to prevent black people from voting. So what we're saying here is that 100 years after Lincoln freed black people still suffered all kinds of discrimination in America, especially in the southern part of the United States. What is interesting, I think, is that most Southerners were Christians. Many went to church and read the Bible, including many lawmakers. Historians tell us it was not unusual that these lawmakers who passed all kinds of laws discriminating against black people went to church and read the Bible. It was a very rare member of the clergy in the South who publicly declared racism to be a very serious sin for which one might suffer eternal damnation. Historians tell us that most of the clergy in the South, most of the ministers, most of the priests went along with racial discrimination. Indeed, it was not until Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous letter from a Birmingham jail, which embarrassed many Southern ministers and priests, that many began to publicly oppose racial discrimination. I have a question for some of my viewers who may be Christians and also who believe in hell. Again, if you are a Christian and you believe in hell, here's the question for you. Do you believe that the slave owners in America and the segregationists and the Southern lawmakers who greatly restricted the opportunities of generations of black people and indeed humiliated them, sometimes even lynching them, might be roasting in hell today? Again, do you think it's possible that many of the slave owners, segregationists, and Southern lawmakers might be roasting in hell today? And of course, that would include some very famous Americans who owned slaves. Remember, Jesus talked about his two most important commandments. Jesus designated two commandments as being the most important. In Matthew 22, Jesus says this: "You shall love the Lord your God." That's the most important commandment. And secondly, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I don't think enslaving other people, discriminating against other people, humiliating other people, lynching other people because of their skin color is an example of loving other people. By the way, do you think today, in 2007, most Christians regard racism as a very serious sin, one for which they could suffer eternal damnation. Again, what do you think? Again, I'm discussing the question, should the law be our guide? Should the law be our guide in determining what is moral? And what I've been doing the last few minutes is talking about some immoral laws that people lived under for centuries. Well, of course, it has not just been the United States that has had immoral laws. Probably all countries in the world. Germany is another good example of this. In 1935, the German government under Adolf Hitler passed what have become known as the Nuremberg laws. These were anti-Semitic laws, anti-Jewish laws. These laws stripped German Jews of their citizenship, so that German Jews who had been citizens of Germany woke up one morning and found out that the law now made them non-citizens. These laws also banned Jews from certain occupations, that under Hitler, Jews could no longer be teachers, they could no longer write and be published, they could not even give concerts. And it also, again, imposed many other disabilities on Jews. Many countries, including the old Soviet Union and China today, have had laws allowing for censorship of the media, censorship of newspapers, of television. Indeed, in China today, they even try to censor the internet. I'll have more to say about this next week, more about immoral laws passed by other governments, other than, again, the United States or Nazi Germany. But right now, as usual, I'd like to conclude with a quote from Henry David Thoreau. Thoreau reminds us that we are all artists. In his masterpiece, Walden, he penned the following words: "To affect the quality of the day, that is the highest of arts."